My name is Daniel Carter, and this is the part of my life I once tried to forget. The night I turned 30, I sat alone at a small table near the window of a quiet restaurant. Rain slid slowly down the glass, and the candle on my birthday cake burned lower with every minute that passed. 3 empty chairs surrounded the table. They were meant for the only people I believed would always show up for me: my mother, my sister Olivia, and the man I thought I would someday marry. I kept checking my phone, telling myself they were probably just running late. But then a notification appeared. It wasn't from them. It was a photo posted online. In that photo, my sister stood in a white dress, smiling as she held the hand of the man who had promised me a future only a few months earlier. The caption said they were celebrating their engagement. I stared at the screen for a long time, trying to understand how my own life had quietly moved forward without me. That night wasn't just a forgotten birthday. It was the moment I realized my family had already chosen a life where I did not belong. Welcome to Auntie Rose narrates. Before today's story of betrayal and self-discovery. Please subscribe and hit like to help these stories be heard. Drop your sit your country in the comments. It always warms my heart. Now, let's begin. If you have ever sat in a room full of empty chairs meant for people who never came, you already understand the silence I felt that night. But what I did not know then was that the story didn't end at that table, because the years that followed would slowly teach me something my family never did. Sometimes the people who leave you behind are the very reason you finally find where you truly belong. And 10 years later, they would come back asking for something they once refused to give me. But to understand that moment, you first have to understand how everything quietly fell apart long before that birthday. Looking back now, I understand that the silence in my family did not begin on my 30th birthday. It had started many years earlier. Quietly, almost gently, the way a small crack forms in a wall before anyone notices the damage. Our house was not loud or chaotic. It was neat, organized, and calm. From the outside, it looked like a peaceful home, but inside there were long pauses between conversations and a kind of distance that slowly grew between us. Most evenings we sat at the same wooden kitchen table. My mother would place plates in front of us without saying much. My sister Olivia usually talked about her day at work or the plans she had with friends. I would listen and nod. Sometimes I would start to say something about my own day, but the moment often passed before the words fully left my mouth. The conversation would move somewhere else. It wasn't cruel in an obvious way. No one told me to be quiet. No one said I didn't matter, but slowly, I began to feel like a guest at my own table. I remember one evening when Olivia was excited about a weekend trip. She and my mother were discussing hotel options and restaurants they wanted to try. Their voices were light and relaxed. I sat there eating my dinner, waiting for someone to ask if I wanted to come. No one did. When the conversation ended, my mother simply stood up and began washing the dishes. It felt strange to realize they had already made the plan without even thinking to include me. Moments like that happened often. Small decisions, small plans, small conversations that moved around me like I wasn't quite part of them, even in the car. The quiet felt heavy. My mother would drive while Olivia sat in the front seat beside her. They talked softly about work, family, friends, and future plans. I sat in the back seat watching the road disappear behind us through the window. Sometimes Olivia would glance back and smile politely, but the conversation never really opened for me. Then Daniel came into my life. At first, he felt like a bridge between the distance I had always felt and the connection I had hoped for. He was warm and patient, the kind of person who looked directly at you when you spoke. For a while, I believed he saw me clearly. When I first introduced him to my family, my mother seemed pleased. Olivia was friendly, maybe even a little curious about him. We had dinner together a few times. Daniel laughed easily with them, asking questions and telling small stories. At the time, I thought it was a good sign, but slowly, something changed. There were moments when Daniel and Olivia seemed to understand each other in ways I didn't notice right away. A shared joke, a conversation that continued long after I had left the room. Nothing obvious. Just small shifts. One evening, I came home from work earlier than usual. The house was quiet except for voices in the kitchen. I stopped in the hallway when I heard Olivia and my mother talking. They didn't know I was there. Daniel's good for her. My mother said softly. Olivia answered after a pause. Yes, but maybe he belongs somewhere else. Their voices lowered after that. Too quiet to hear clearly. I stood there for a moment before walking back to my room. I told myself I had misunderstood, but after that day, I noticed things I hadn't before. Daniel sometimes canceled plans with me because he was busy. Olivia began mentioning his name more often in casual conversation, and every time I felt the small knot of worry forming in my chest, I tried to ignore it. I didn't want to believe that the quiet distance in my family could grow into something deeper. Then came my 30th birthday. Evening at the restaurant was the first moment when everything became clear. The empty chairs, the candle burning low. The photo on my phone showing Olivia smiling beside the man who had once promised to build a life with me. In that moment, I understood something simple and painful. They had already chosen a story that did not include me. So I paid the bill, picked up the small gift bag I had brought for my sister, and walked out into the rain. By the end of that night, I packed one suitcase and I left the house where I had spent most of my life. No one tried to stop me. The first place I stayed after leaving home was a small room above a quiet coffee shop on the edge of town. It wasn't much. The ceiling slanted slightly, and the window looked out over a narrow street where people passed by without noticing the building at all. The room had a simple bed, a wooden chair, and a small desk pushed against the wall. My suitcase sat unopened in the corner for almost a week. Told myself it was temporary. I didn't want to settle anywhere yet. Settling meant believing I belonged somewhere, and I wasn't ready to believe that again. The coffee shop downstairs opened early every morning. Around 6 o'clock, the sound of the door unlocking and chairs being moved across the floor would wake me. That was how I first met Mrs. Alvarez. She owned the shop. She was a quiet woman in her late 60s who moved slowly but with purpose. Her hair was silver and always tied back neatly. She spoke in a calm voice that never rushed. The first time we spoke was simple. Had come downstairs one morning to buy coffee before work. When I placed my order, she looked at me for a moment and said gently, "You live upstairs now?" It wasn't a question. I nodded. She placed a cup of coffee on the counter and added a small plate with a slice of toast beside it. "I didn't order that," I said. "You look like you forgot breakfast." She replied softly. That was all. There was no curiosity about my past. No questions about why I had moved there. She simply handed me the plate and moved on to wiping the counter. It was the first small kindness I had experienced in a long time. At first, I didn't trust it. I had learned that kindness could quietly disappear when it was no longer convenient. So I kept my conversations short. I paid for my coffee and left quickly each morning, but the routine slowly formed. Every morning I came downstairs before work. Mrs. Alvarez would already have the coffee ready. Sometimes there was toast, sometimes a small bowl of fruit. Sometimes nothing but the coffee and the quiet. And strangely, that quiet began to feel comfortable. In the evenings, I often sat by the window in my room. The rain would tap against the glass just like it had on my birthday. But now the sound didn't feel quite as heavy. The suitcase still sat in the corner. One evening, Mrs. Alvarez knocked lightly on my door. When I opened it, she held a folded note in her hand. "You received mail downstairs," she said. It wasn't a letter from my family. It was a notice from the local community college confirming my enrollment in evening classes I had applied for weeks earlier. I looked at the paper for a long moment. "Good news?" she asked gently. "I think so," I said. She nodded once. That's how things begin. After that, life slowly found a rhythm. Mornings started with coffee downstairs. Days were spent working at a small office job I had managed to keep. Evenings were for classes at the college. At first, it felt exhausting. My mind wandered during lectures, and I sometimes sat quietly in the back of the classroom, wondering if I really belonged there. But week by week, the feeling changed. I began to understand the lessons. I completed assignments. I passed my first exam. It wasn't a big achievement to anyone else, but for me, it felt like proof that my life had not stopped moving. One evening, when I returned from class, I noticed something different in my room. My suitcase was no longer closed. Mrs. Alvarez stood near the desk, folding a sweater I had left inside. "I hope you don't mind," she said calmly. "It looked like you planned to stay longer." I stood there, quietly for a moment, then I walked over to the suitcase and began placing my clothes into the small dresser beside the bed. It was the first time I had unpacked since leaving home. The room looked different afterward, less temporary. A few weeks later, Mrs. Alvarez handed me something small while I was finishing my morning coffee. It was a brass key for the back door, she explained, "so you don't have to walk around the building at night." I turned the key in my hand. It was simple, slightly worn, probably one of many copies, but it meant something more than access to a door. It meant trust. That night, as I climbed the narrow stairs to my room, I paused at the top and looked down at the quiet coffee shop below. The lights were dim. The chairs were stacked neatly on the tables. The smell of coffee still lingered in the air. For the first time in years, a thought came to me that felt both strange and comforting. This place felt steady. It felt safe. And as I stepped into my small room and closed the door behind me, I heard myself say a word I hadn't used in a long time: home. Life did not suddenly become easy after that, but it did become steady. My days slowly formed a routine that felt solid under my feet. I worked at a small administrative office during the day, answering phones, organizing files, and doing the quiet tasks that kept the place running. In the evenings, I attended my classes at the community college. At first, I studied business management simply because it seemed practical. I needed something that could lead to stable work, something that would allow me to support myself without depending on anyone. It wasn't glamorous, but every completed assignment felt like another brick being placed beneath my future. I began waking up earlier than before. Some mornings, I arrived downstairs at the coffee shop while Mrs. Alvarez was still grinding the beans for the first pot of coffee. Eventually, I started helping her before leaving for work. At first, it was small things: wiping tables, carrying boxes from the back storage room, setting chairs straight. She never asked me to do it, but she always nodded with quiet appreciation. "You're building good habits," she once said while handing me a clean towel for the counter. I wasn't sure if she meant the shop or my life. Maybe both. As the months turned into years, I finished my classes and received my certificate. The day the college mailed it to me, I held the envelope in my hands for a long time before opening it. Not because I was afraid, because I realized something had changed inside me. There had been a time when I wanted achievements only so people would notice me, so they would finally see my value, but that feeling was slowly disappearing. The certificate, Was not proof for them, it was proof for me, soon after I was promoted at the office. It wasn't a large position, but it meant a small salary increase and more responsibility. I began managing records and helping train new employees. The first time I signed my name on an official document as a supervisor, I paused for a moment, it felt strange, not powerful, just earned. My savings account slowly grew. Not quickly, but steadily. Each month, I placed a small portion of my income aside. After a few years, I was able to move from the small room above the coffee shop into a modest apartment a few blocks away. When I told Mrs. Alvarez the news, she smiled warmly. "That means you are growing," she said, but I didn't move far. I still visited the shop almost every morning, and over time, something else happened. I began noticing people who looked the way I once felt. Young students sitting alone with their books. A woman who stayed longer than necessary just to avoid going home. A quiet man who counted coins carefully before ordering coffee. Loneliness has a familiar shape when you've lived with it long enough. Sometimes I would sit beside them and start small conversations. Nothing heavy, just simple kindness. If a student struggled with school applications, I helped them fill out the forms. If someone needed advice about evening classes, I shared my experience. Occasionally, I paid for a cup of coffee when someone looked like they needed a quiet place to breathe. Never told them my story. They didn't need to hear it, but I understood their silence. One evening, after helping a nervous student submit her college registration online, she looked at me and said softly, "I don't think I could have done that alone." I smiled gently. "You probably could have," I said, "but it's easier when someone sits beside you." Later that night, walking back to my apartment, I realized something important. For many years, I had tried to prove my worth to people who had already decided not to see it, but somewhere along the way, that need had faded. I was no longer trying to prove my value to anyone. I was simply living inside it, and strangely, that quiet realization made the world feel much larger than it had before. I did not know it yet, but the life I had slowly built would soon be tested, because 10 years after the night of my 30th birthday, my past would come knocking on my door again. The years after that moved quietly, almost gently. Nothing dramatic happened. There were no sudden breakthroughs or moments where a life suddenly felt perfect. But little by little, things began to change in ways that felt real. My classes at the community college slowly turned into something more than just evening lessons. At first, I had taken them simply to keep moving forward, but as time passed, I began to understand the work more deeply. I studied business management and community services, learning how small organizations function and how people build stable systems that help others. Some nights I stayed in the college library long after most students had gone home. The quiet rows of books and the soft hum of the lights above the tables felt strangely comforting. I was not trying to impress anyone. I was simply building something inside myself. During the day, my work at the office continued to grow as well. What started as a small administrative job slowly turned into a position with more responsibility. I organized records, helped manage schedules, and eventually began training new staff members. The paycheck wasn't large, but each year it grew a little. For the first time in my life, I began saving money. At first, it was only small amounts, $20 here, $50 there, but watching the savings account slowly grow gave me a quiet sense of control over my own life. No one could take that stability away. After a few years, I was able to move from the small room above the coffee shop into a modest apartment nearby. It wasn't big, but it had sunlight in the mornings and a kitchen table where I could sit with a cup of coffee before work. On the day I received the keys, I stood in the empty living room for a long time, not because it was impressive, but because it was mine. Still, I never drifted far from the coffee shop. Mrs. Alvarez remained part of my routine. I stopped by many mornings before work, and sometimes I helped her close the shop in the evenings. Over time, the place became something more than just a cafe. It became a quiet meeting point for people who needed somewhere steady. And slowly, without planning it, I began helping others in small ways. Some students from the community college started coming in regularly to study. When they struggled with paperwork or class schedules, I sat beside them and explained the process. I remembered how confusing those forms had once felt to me. Sometimes, a young person would sit alone at the corner table for hours, staring at their phone or their books with a tired expression. I recognized that look immediately. Loneliness has a language you never forget. So I would walk over with a cup of coffee and say something simple. Long day? Most conversations started that way, not as advice, not as lectures, just presence. Once, a young woman who had been visiting the shop for weeks finally told me she was afraid she might fail her classes and disappoint her family. I listened quietly, then I said something. I have learned the hard way. Your life isn't a test you have to pass for other people. She sat silently for a moment, then nodded. Moments like that became more common as the years passed. I never told those people my full story. They didn't need to hear it, but the understanding was there, quietly sitting between us. And one evening, while walking home from the coffee shop, I realized something important had changed inside me. For a long time, I had been trying to prove my worth. To my family, to the man who left, to the people who had once looked through me like I wasn't there. But somewhere along the way, that need had slowly disappeared. I stopped walking so fast. I stood beneath a streetlight for a moment, feeling the cool night air settle around me. And the truth came quietly. I was no longer trying to prove my worth. I was learning to live inside it. And that quiet understanding gave me something stronger than validation. It gave me peace. I didn't know then that my past would soon return, but when it did, I would be standing on a life I had built with my own hands. 10 years later, my life had become something steady. The small apartment was no longer empty. Books filled the shelves, plants rested near the windows, and the kitchen table had become the place where I drank my morning coffee before work. The quiet routines I had built over the years now felt natural, like a rhythm my life had finally settled into. I was helping manage a small community program connected to the college. Most of my work focused on helping adult students return to school, guiding them through applications, schedules, and the uncertainty that often comes with starting over. In many ways, I saw pieces of my younger self in the people who walked through those doors. One afternoon, while I was finishing paperwork at my desk, the receptionist knocked softly on the open door. "There's someone here asking for you," she said. I assumed it was another student needing help with enrollment forms, but when I stepped into the hallway, I saw 3 people standing near the entrance. My mother, my sister Olivia, and Daniel. For a moment, no one spoke. 10 years is a long time, but recognition happens instantly. Their faces had aged slightly, lines forming where time had passed, but they were still unmistakably the people I had once built my world around. Olivia was the first to break the silence. "Hi, Daniel," she said softly. Hearing my name in her voice again felt strange, like hearing an old song you had once played every day, but hadn't heard in years. We moved into a small meeting room nearby, the same kind of room where I usually sat with students discussing their plans for the future. Now I sat across from my past. My mother folded her hands carefully on the table. "Heard you've been doing well," she said. It wasn't quite pride. It wasn't quite regret. Just a careful statement. Olivia glanced at Daniel before speaking again. Things have been difficult lately. I listened quietly. Over the next few minutes, the story slowly unfolded. Daniel's business had struggled. Investments had failed. The house they once owned had been sold. They were staying temporarily with relatives while trying to find stability again. At one point, Olivia looked down at the table and said quietly, "We thought maybe you could help us. Just for a little while." No one said the word sorry. No one mentioned my 30th birthday. No one explained the photograph that had once ended an entire chapter of my life. They spoke carefully, as if the past were something fragile that might break if touched directly. I sat there listening, feeling surprisingly calm. The anger I once imagined carrying into a moment like this was not there anymore. Instead, I felt something quieter. Distance. After they finished speaking, the room became silent again. I looked at each of them for a moment before answering. My life changed the night I realized something. I said slowly. They waited. Family isn't defined by who shares your last name, I continued. It's defined by who shows up when your chair is empty. No one interrupted. I stood up from the table gently. I hope things improve for you, I said calmly. Truly. Olivia looked up quickly, as if hoping there might be more, but there wasn't. I can't be the place you come to only when there's nowhere else to go. My voice was steady, not angry, not cold. Just honest. For a moment. None of them moved. Then I walked to the door and opened it. The hallway outside was quiet, filled with the familiar sounds of people working and moving forward with their lives. I stepped out first, and without raising my voice or looking back, I continued walking down the hall toward the life I had built without them. After that day, I did not hear from them again for a long time. Life returned to its quiet rhythm, the same way it always had after difficult moments. I went back to my office, finished the paperwork on my desk, and met with the next student who needed help filling out an application. The world had not stopped, and neither had I. Months later, I heard small pieces of news through distant relatives and mutual acquaintances. Not dramatic stories, just the quiet updates that moved through families over time. My mother had moved into a smaller apartment in another town. Age had begun to slow her down, and the large house she once cared for was long gone. From what I heard, she spent most of her days reading and attending a small community church nearby. No. One said she was unhappy, but people mentioned that she had grown. Quieter than before. Olivia and Daniel eventually found work in a different city. Their lives seemed modest now compared to the ambitions they once spoke about years earlier. The business Daniel had tried to build never fully recovered, and they both returned to more ordinary jobs. There was no scandal, no dramatic collapse, just the slow adjustment to a life that looked different from what they once expected. Sometimes I wondered if they ever thought about that night at the restaurant or the conversation we had 10 years later in that meeting room, but those thoughts no longer carried the weight they once did. I did not wish them harm, and I did not celebrate the difficulties they faced. Life has a way of balancing things on its own, often more quietly than we imagine. People make choices, and over time those choices shape the paths they walk. Their paths simply moved in a different direction from mine. These days, my mornings begin the same way they have for many years. I wake up early, make a cup of coffee, and sit by the window while the city slowly comes to life. People walk past on their way to work, the same quiet rhythm repeating itself every day. Sometimes I stop by the coffee shop where Mrs. Alvarez still greets customers with the same gentle smile. The place feels familiar in a way that is hard to explain, not because it is perfect, but because it was there when I needed somewhere steady. Over time, I have come to understand something simple about belonging. Family is not always the people who share your past. Sometimes it is the people who quietly stand beside you while you build your future, the ones who make room for you at the table, ones who notice when your chair is empty. I no longer carry the pain of that 30th birthday the way I once did. The memory is still there, but it no longer defines who I am. Life moved forward. And so did I, Dot, and when I sit at my kitchen table now, with a warm cup of coffee and the soft morning light filling the room, I feel something that once seemed impossible, Dot, not revenge, Dot, not regret, just peace.